All right, we are live. Awkward. Hey, people. Karen, can you shut the door? We already have a question.
Cool.
We have 0 viewers, though, so that's good because we're fumbling like maniacs.
I have a little bit of an echo. Do you have a suggestion on what I can do?
Do you hear my echo from me?
Yes. Both of you, actually. Should I just mute it?
Yeah, maybe.
How about I mute it until, like, I talk?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, cool.
Are you still getting it? Okay, cool. Awesome.
It's perfect. What if I mute you until I talk?
Okay, awesome. All right, so we're here. Can you guys hear me? Thumbs up? Okay, so welcome to the second hangout with our guest, Lyric Cabral. I'm Elaine, and this is my buddy, Sarah.
Hi.
And we're very excited to have Lyric this week. She's just back from Sundance, where she's won an amazing award and got a lot of really great recognition for a project she's been working a lot on, which you heard about in the episode if you listened. Lyric, would you like to tell us a little bit about the project and tell us what happened at Sundance to get us started?
Hi, everyone. Thank you guys for listening and for your questions in advance. I'm Lyric, and I'm working on co-directing a documentary called Terror. Terror is one of the first films to document an active FBI counterterrorism sting operation from the perspective of a 63-year-old former Black Panther turned FBI informant. And he has worked for the FBI for the past 22 years, and the film really explores his role in an active case in Pittsburgh, as well as a couple of cases in his history. And we were fortunate enough to win the Special Grand Jury Prize for Breakout First Feature Film at Sundance 2015. And it has been a whirlwind, and I'm just now getting back, like last night. And yeah, that's the intro. Thank you guys for being here.
Awesome. Well, that's amazing. I'm so excited. What was your reaction to, well, how did it all go down? Like, I've never been to Sundance, so what's it like, and what was your reaction, and was it just a whirlwind?
I had never actually been to Sundance either, and so it was beautiful. Like this year, apparently was one of the warmest years, so there was no snow. There was just snow around us on the mountains, but like no major snowstorm while we were in town. It was very hectic. We did a lot of interviews, which was amazing. Got to speak to a lot of press, international, domestic. Really hanging out with other filmmakers was cool. Aside from all the pressures of competition, the U.S. documentary competition, we were a part of that. So we were one of 16 docs in competition. But getting to hang out with the filmmakers, getting to have sort of quality time, learning about other people's process, and being able to see the work that they produce and then ask them questions right there on the spot was really like amazing.
Awesome. Great. I want to start with one of Scott's questions because he's the lucky person that's not on this chat. Scott from Filmmaker Magazine sent in some questions. He would typically be joining us, but he couldn't join us today. And he was one of the lucky ones who actually saw the film at Sundance. And so he has some questions that I think would be good to start us off with. And one of them is, what was your personal feelings towards the subject, and was it hard to keep them out of the film?
Well, I knew our subject before I knew he was an informant. And so I really met a person who was very intriguing to me, who was very intelligent, who was very charismatic. And so also during that period that I knew him, unbeknownst, I didn't know he was an informant. And so while I knew him in this capacity of just like being an interesting older man, I was going to counterterrorism trials. I was photographing the families of terrorism defendants. And literally, I had no clue that I had an informant in my building. And so my perspective coming into this film was duly informed. Because the thing about informants, of course you want to villainize them. They do horrible things. They set people up. They betray people. They send people to jail for multiple years. But there's something about these people that enables the targets or the defendants to sit down with them and even be in a position where they can be, quote unquote, entrapped. And so it was very important to me while reporting to her and while making the film that his humanity be evident, that he be portrayed as a whole person, in addition to the sort of the demonization of the acts that he commits. And so that was very important to me. So coming into the story, you know, I can just say that I was well informed. I knew the feelings of all sides. It was important to me that I put the perspectives of the family members of, you know, that he sent to jail. But it was also important to me that I include his motivations and why he personally feels that he should do this work.
Do you feel that the film has an activist intention? Like, what could we do to curb investigative overreach?
Well, I personally think it's very, you know, it's very difficult to separate your politics from your activism. Julian Assange says that the best way to achieve justice is to expose injustice. And so I don't know if that's an activist quote, but I feel like that's a quote that accurately summates my philosophy. Is that activist? Maybe a little bit, because I do want to achieve justice through my reporting. But I don't want to like let the audience, I don't want to be heavy-handed. I just want to present facts. I will never, you know, I never want the audience to per se know my opinion through watching the film. Maybe collectively after you sit with it at the end, yes, you will probably know my opinion. But I hate like beating people over the head with opinion and not fact.
I have a quick question too. What was your relationship like before? Like, what kinds of things would you guys discuss before he kind of let you know? And did you feel like your friendship changed? I mean, I'm sure it did, but yeah, just kind of what was it like before? What kind of things would you discuss, you know, when you would hang out before you knew?
Well, I met him when I was 19, and so like, you know, if you think back to when you were 19, I was developing ideology. I was developing my opinion and my worldview. I was learning how to report in communities. Like, so when we were talking, it was a very open conversation. It was like right after 9/11, so there was really not much concern for surveillance and security. And, you know, he asked me informant-like things in the sense of like current events, politics, you know, religious. Like, he would ask me if I wasn't Muslim. I am now. I wasn't Muslim at the time, but he would ask me, you know, about things going on in the Middle East. And I think, you know, there wasn't much to engage there because my major was Latin American studies and journalism, so I didn't know much about the Middle East at that time. So it was almost like I couldn't fully feed into the conversations he was trying to engage me in. They were very surface. And so that's why I think, you know, I don't know if to this day he was sent to target me, but all of the sort of conditions for that surveillance were in place. But but to answer your question, what we spoke about, everything, just about his time in the Black Panther Party, about what I wanted to do when I was older, the type of journalism I wanted to do, current events, what was happening in the world, terrorist acts. These are questions that he would ask.
That's fascinating.
It is. We have a question on the Q&A side from Claire. The most poignant moment in your interview for me was when you asserted that your work should be driven, journalists should have a beat. What was one of the pivotal moments in defining what yours would be?
That's a good question. I also, in thinking that you should have a beat, I think, you know, sometimes I think there's a tendency to, like, if you read the news and if you look at the stories that are getting coverage, they often seem to be very big, like, oh, people are going abroad. Like, that was something that was daunting for me when I was looking at how to start out and, you know, what could my beat be? What could I possibly report? Like, I didn't have the money to go to Yemen. Like, all the stories and, you know, the front page were coming from abroad. And so to answer your question, you really have to look at the stories that are closest to you. Every single story I've reported, my first story, Old Habits, for instance, which was about elderly addiction. At the time I lived in Harlem. That story came from observing Harlem in the streets. I simply saw that, you know, it was older people that were visibly addicted from like heroin. These are on the street corners. I saw literally old people nodding out with canes. And so that was an observation. It was a question that was intriguing to me. So as far as finding a beat, all of my national security stories were close to me. I was a teacher in Harlem working at an after-school program, and one of my students was arrested on national security charges. So that story was close to me. The informant lived in my building. You know, so while I'm struggling, like looking for all these stories in the world, like what could possibly be picked up? How could I possibly find my beat? It was actually right near me. You know, and I would encourage people to pursue their areas of interest. If you are just reading the news, like, is there a particular story that always interests you? That may be your beat. You know, is it crime? Is it environmental reporting? Just literally what interests you most. If you pursue that, you'll find your characters, you'll find your lead, because it's based on personal passion.
Do you think this will continue? Do you think this will be your beat for, years to come, or do you kind of see maybe shifting to something else?
I think that's a good question. I don't want to get stuck in this area of reporting, but at the same time, now I'm at a juncture where, because I have done such public reporting on this topic, I'm starting to get unsolicited stories. I'm starting to get leads. So it's like I don't necessarily want. I do want to keep reporting on national security issues, but for my whole life, no. But now I feel a different type of obligation because the stories are coming now that the work is out there, and I don't quite know how to abandon that.
Maybe
it's a new challenge.
Maybe you'll have like a Ed Snowden come, email you and. But I have a question from Twitter. Trisha Folks asked this one, and she just wants to know, how do you get your work noticed with the web saturated with such good work and some not so good? But how do you kind of stand out amongst the many?
That's a good question. Maybe I'm an optimist, but I think good work speaks for itself. I also think you must network, right? Like if you know that you're producing good work, if you know that you have a story that needs to be seen, I think there is an obligation there for you to try the best you can to make sure that that story reaches an audience. I forgot who it was. It might have been Aaron Swartz, but he talked about sending emails to the heads of companies, even down to, like, if you don't know someone's email address, if they're at the New York Times, like, if you look in the paper and see how people's emails are formatted, you can figure out where to send your portfolio or where your story is. So I think you have to be, yes, we do live in an oversaturated media environment. That's particularly why you can find that email address. And if you believe that your story is worth it, I truly believe you'll take every means to get it out there. And I personally have done that. Like when I first started reporting on the Newburgh 4, and my angle was entrapment, nobody wanted that story. Nobody wants to think a terrorist didn't do it, but the nation did. And it took a lot of emailing, but I was not daunted because I sort of had a family on my back that was like, hey, when is the story coming out? Because I'd been shooting them so much, and I couldn't tell them I couldn't place the story. Honestly, I could not tell them that. And so that is when sometimes you just have to get the work out there. You really do, by all means.
I love that. I think you're a really interesting journalist, and that you do feel this responsibility to the people that share their story with you, which I think is very important. And how do you, we have a question coming in, but I'm going to ask one question first. How do you what is the line for you that you keep between is there a thing that's too close to your subjects for you, or how do you balance that as a journalist and as a documentary filmmaker now, which can be different ways of balancing that?
That's a good question. I think too close for me is when a subject feels comfortable or starts saying things to me that I think they can influence the reporting or the way I perceive them. I'm a very nosy person in the sense that, like, when I'm documenting you, like, you're not my friend, but you're my friend in the sense I like to know what you're doing. I want to know who you're talking to. Like, I'm very inquisitive, and that, so the boundary for me though is I'll stop getting so close when I feel that the subject sort of interprets that closeness as their ability to influence the reporting.
Cool, awesome. Well, we have two comments on the side from Nicole Hart, Nicole Prowl Hart. So the first is, first of all, Sundance, congrats. Where will this take you? Where will this now take you, the film, and your future work? So I know you guys have a broadcast deal. Is that correct?
Yes. So Terror will be broadcast in 2016 on ICBS. We're not quite sure which strand yet, and also on BBC Storyville. And as far as the next step, since this is my first film, I know that I definitely want to make another. Right now, I'm sort of trying to develop that, look for funds for my next project. And as far as the future, we want to develop. We want to have a strong impact campaign for Terror. We really are committed to using the film as a teaching tools and going throughout Muslim communities and non-Muslim communities throughout the United States and really doing Know Your Rights workshops and partnering with law schools and Muslim student associations and just really talking in public and creating a safe space for dialogue around issues of surveillance and like racial profiling, because right now there aren't really many community spaces for this type of dialogue about the impacts of the war on terror at a community level. And so we're very committed to using the film to stimulate those conversations.
Awesome. And before I ask her next question, how do you think you'll measure impact and success when it comes to impact? Because I know it's like it's a big topic right now, using media for impact. So like, in the ideal case, what is it a change of attitude that you want to create? Is it actually like a change in policy? Like, what is it for you that would be success and impact?
Well, personally, I think impact is, can be achieved on two levels. On the grassroots level, I think it's what I said, like stimulating conversations. That would be enough for me, encouraging this debate, fostering a safe space that beyond the film, these discussions can continue in these communities that have been impacted by surveillance, primarily Muslim communities after 9/11, or those that have been sort of disproportionately impacted, but also at a policy level. Another audience that we desperately want to reach is like law enforcement, the FBI, the Marshal Service, people that work in the TSA, anybody that has a hand in sort of this war on terror apparatus and profiling folks in the name of national security. Like, we really want to reach those folks and impact policy. We want to stimulate, the regulation over the use of informants. We really want to encourage surveillance in all segments of our society and not just disproportionately in the Muslim community. We want to encourage dialogues about looking at white extremism as a form of terrorism. So all these are sort of our impact goals.
Awesome. Go ahead, Sarah.
This is just a question I always throw around in my mind, but or something that I struggle with even. But how do you balance? How do you make a living? How do you balance just doing this out of the passion of the project and actually making money? What projects do you decide to take on? What do you say no to? And how do you make a living doing this?
That's a tough question, in the sense of, everyone is preoccupied with funding. You do need to be able to get money for the stories that you want to cover for obvious reasons. But maybe I've just been lucky, but I honestly think it's in the selection of story. I've never had a problem publishing work, and I don't think that's because I'm a lucky person. I think it's because I choose smart stories, like I said, that have not been seen, that these are stories you can't get it from anywhere else. You're not going to hear a similar pitch, and it's a story that is in need of being told. It's a story that has human resonance for a lot of audiences. So I really think, as far as sustainability, it's the stories. That's the heart of our profession, is storytelling. I really think you have to find a good story, and if you have the fortitude and it's high production value and it's a great story, the obstacles will be much fewer for you.
Awesome. So there's a comment saying, I really appreciate hearing your comment on race and gender in terms of getting access to stories and knowing how to leverage other players and gaining access as well. It's not necessarily a question, but it is something that you mentioned that there were things you could have elaborated on in the podcast. Is this one of those things? And maybe share with us something that maybe people didn't hear in the podcast that you would like to share.
Sure. Well, I guess coming into documentary, an example that I always use to sort of illustrate this point, it doesn't have to do with gender, but it does have to do with race, is the film Two Towns of Jasper. Now, Two Towns of Jasper is a documentary film. It's one of my favorite films. It's made by two filmmakers, Whitney Dow, who's white, who's a white man, and Marco Williams, who's black. And the reason why that's critical is because the film, the premise is, James Byrd, he was the victim of a hate crime. He was drugged through the town of Jasper, Texas, from the back of a pickup truck. And these two filmmakers wanted to really illumine the full story of this town in the throes of a hate crime. And just to give you an example of the town, it was one of those, the railroad tracks divided two sides of the town, very segregated. Blacks stayed with the blacks, the whites stayed with the whites, and they really wanted to document this hate crime. And they were smart to know the landscape of Jasper, Texas, given what happened. And they knew that, in isolation, the black filmmaker couldn't have really effectively gone to the suspects, to the white families whose children were accused of committing this crime. And the white filmmaker likewise understood that he could not go to James Byrd's family and sort of document their experiences trying to get justice in this other town. And so collectively they went, and neither told either community. So Marco Williams was embedded with James Byrd's family. He did not mention Whitney Dow was on the other side of town filming with the suspects. And likewise, Whitney Dow did not mention to the families of the defendants in the hate crime that Marco Williams was capturing, the other side. And collectively, they made a brilliant film. You know, so that is understanding the limits of access. It's nothing personal. You know, they are both excellent journalists. Unfortunately, because of the America in which we live, Marco Williams could not have gone and gotten honest conversations from the families of those defendants. So that's sort of what I mean. You know, you really honestly have to recognize, and that comes through experience, right? It comes from shooting in the field. That comes from seeing how people look at you when you pull out a camera. That comes from like seeing how much negotiation you have to do to document. If you want to take, you know, 6 weeks getting access, sure. But if you want, it could take somebody else a day. If you know that, it's just, you know, I feel like you have to understand your limitations of access as a journalist in order to report well. You know, if you really want to get all sides of the story, you might need to get somebody else to get that interview. You might need to send a different cinematographer on the field that day.
Yeah, which actually was one of Scott's questions, which was how did you and David split the cinematography? Like, how did you split up the shooting? And this was your first time film, you're a photojournalist, so that's not something that we really talked about too much in the podcast. Any advice to photojournalists turning to be filmmakers?
Sure. So to the first part of that, David and I, we pretty much filmed everything together in the sense of like interviews, we used 2 cameras. When we were out in the field, we used 2 cameras. There are some scenes in the film, however, that he shot individually and that I shot individually. One being like the mother of Tariq Shah is someone whose case is profiled in terror. He's someone whom our main character sort of set up in 2005, and he's now doing 15 years on a terrorism charge. Material support. He's now in jail. He's now in jail because he provided material support for Al Qaeda. But our main character was directly responsible for that case. And you know, his mom went to go visit him. 9-hour drive in the car, hotel room. With, you know, so a situation like that, I just shot it because obviously as a woman, as African-American woman, there's like a connection there that might enable her to be, it's just easier. You know, like driving to the jail, she might feel more comfortable talking to me. So that's a decision that we made internally. Similarly, there's a scene in the film where an FBI arrest takes place. And David shot that because the composition of the FBI is all white, all male. He's the same height as the agents. He can actually get an eye shot. So it's things like this, like, you know, what will be better for the film? These are decisions that, yes, we split everything, cinematography, but some scenes are best shot by individuals.
And any tips to photojournalists looking to shoot video or films?
Practice. Just like, you know, the eye is a muscle, just like with photography, you'll only get better by doing composition every day, exercising your eye. If you're trying to segue from photojournalism to video, I would say it takes a lot of practice because if you're a good photographer, you already have like the framing. That's not the issue. The motion is the issue. Like film is moving video. You know, it's moving video. It's a moving image. And so I would say for me, it took a lot of practice, like with panning and speed. Like these are things you don't necessarily think about when making still images, but definitely, you know, how to follow someone well and smoothly. These are things that took a lot of practice for me.
I have a follow-up to that real quick, which is whenever, like, do you ever just kind of go out in the field and photograph and maybe switch modes and start filming something or vice versa? And does that ever, like, confuse you a little bit, or do you ever feel conflicted between which medium you want to use?
What's interesting is since I've been doing documentary video work, I've been photographing less. And the jobs that I've been getting, interestingly enough, are a lot of like still photography for documentary. So I've been doing, like I helped to do images for a film called Out in the Night. And you know, so I've been getting work doing images for film, which is very interesting. So ever since I have been shooting documentary video, I've been shooting photographic stills less. But what I'll find myself doing is I do shoot a lot of just video verite in the field, not necessarily for a particular project, but just to sort of keep my eye active. And then I'll always take stills at the end. It's really funny. Every time I take video, I'm always thinking about stills, but I won't do it until I've fully captured the video.
Cool. We have 2 questions on the chat. One is, entrapment, it seems, has become a continuing component of the kinds of stories you tell. In what way do you relate to these stories personally, and do you imagine this to continue to be a theme in further work of stories outside of the specific topic?
Is entrapment a theme in my work? I think FBI surveillance is a theme in my work. I don't want entrapment to be, but unfortunately it seems that that is what the government has been engaging in. But what's interesting is entrapment has never won as a legal defense. So I think I will continue personally this line of work until at least one person is successful. But I don't, it's an interesting question. What is my personal connection to entrapment? I'm just more interested in FBI surveillance, the use of the FBI in the United States to quell political dissent. The FBI is supposed to be an investigative body that's keeping us all safe. But if you look at history, and if you look at like COINTELPRO, if you look at how the FBI targeted all the movements in the 60s, from like the Weather Underground to the American Indian movement to the Black Panther Party to the Young Lords, so it's so much. And it's continuing today. So I think my work is really looking at the intersections of like surveillance, race, freedom of religious expression, more so than entrapment.
We have an interesting question. Says, what is the process of making sure that the work goes undetected until released?
That's a good question. I think, Laura Poitras has been sort of on the vanguard of journalistic security. But I think, we're under so much surveillance now. The stories I like to tell, I do like to keep them under wraps until they're sort of ready to be released. But as far as how, there are a lot of, I use encrypted mail. PGP Tools is a free program that's sort of available for everyone. You can take such extreme measures as having an air-gapped computer. An air-gapped computer is one that has never been connected to the internet. It's one that you only use for footage of sensitive stories, so that it's never exposed to any type of being connected to online. It's never at risk. There's secure instant messaging, Adium. I personally don't really use too many webcams. This is like rare for me. I actually don't. I can tell you, I uncovered my webcam before this started. But it's just, I think you do have a tremendous. It depends on the level of story you want to tell. If you want to report a story like Citizen4, you have to be ready. Laura Poitras had encryption set up. She was ready to receive that email. But I think it's critical in this day and age to really protect your data and to protect your sources as best as you can. And also to protect your story, right? Because you don't want, there becomes a point in everyone's story where you're in. No one can steal your story. You have the trust of your subjects. You have a lot of footage. You have enough to go on. But until you get to that point, you don't really want your story out there if it's one that others can access and sort of easily take you out of the equation. So really protecting your sources and your story is critical.
What does it mean to you to be a journalist in 2015 now? I mean, what does that word mean to you? And how do you see the field, especially as like a, I know you work a couple different jobs, but you do freelance too. So how do you see the field, and what does that word mean to you today?
To be honest, I think in 2015 the journalism that I lean toward more is citizen journalism, meaning independent media, people reporting their own stories from the field. There's not like an expert speaking at you, telling you how to think, narrating the story. I really think journalism nowadays, if you look at the journalism that came out of, Tahrir Square, if you look at a documentary like The Square, the fact that that is entirely composed almost of citizen journalism, that ordinary people shot, YouTube videos. So I think journalism nowadays is really, I think journalists are really independent folks. I prefer, every story I've ever done, I've always just reported it and then sold it. Really. I've always done what I wanted to do and just found a home for it. Until I got to the Village Voice, where sort of they gave me excellent stories. The Village Voice, there was an editor there who was immaculate. He never gave me a story that I wouldn't have gone to on my own. But I think journalism now, it's really motivated by individuals. If you look at Twitter, I love checking Twitter. That's sort of one of my news sources, just to see, if you follow people. Twitter is a beautiful thing because you can follow actual people in these countries and get live reporting. So that's sort of my take on journalism now.
Which, by the way, you can follow Lyric at camera_meander on Twitter, right? If
yes.
People want to.
Thank you for the shout out.
Yeah.
Sarah, do you have any final questions? I know it's 3:32. We started a couple minutes late, but I want to make sure Lyric has the final word on on what she wants the you know, the audience and listeners to know that maybe wasn't in the podcast. But Sarah, if you have any final questions.
No, I'd like to hear anything that Lyric has to say.
Are there no more questions? I would love to take questions. I mean,
there are no more questions, except, well,
Okay.
there is one more question, actually, of Scott's, and I forgot about it. Sorry, Scott. It's right here.
I'll take it.
Oh, no, I asked them. But I think they're, to you, like, I'm curious, when it comes to, what is the difference between journalists and documentary filmmakers, do you think? Do you think there's a difference, and do you think activism has anything to do with that? And how do you see the two fields? What could the two fields learn from each other, since you've sort of been in both now?
I think there's an interesting part of documentary filmmaking. That's a very expansive term. If you look at, like, from salesmen to, like, you know, the act of killing, that's a very broad range of nonfiction storytelling. And I think there's a lot more creative flexibility in how to tell a nonfiction story in the filmmaking side that can never happen in journalism, right? Because journalism is strictly factual, depending on who you're producing the piece for. There might be editorial regulations about how it has to be written and how you have to attribute sources, but none of that exists in filmmaking, right? In telling a nonfiction story on screen. So I think that's sort of what is missing from journalism, although I consider terror very much to be a piece of journalism, just because it is factual. We have reported on all sides. In the creative element, we're just allowed to express our translation of the story as creatively as we want to be through the filmmaking. Did that hopefully answer?
I had a question. You brought up salesmen,
Yeah.
and I know that in in maybe some of your early training, did you work or attend the Maysles Institute, and is that correct? And what did you do there? And did you work with Al Maysles? And yeah, just tell me about your experience there, because I've always been curious what that is like.
Yes, and so my transition, I'm trying to do this quick. My transition from photojournalism to filmmaking really started when I took a class at the Maysles Institute. So the Maysles Institute is a community cinema in Harlem. They have an education program for adults and teenagers. And the cinema is donation. They show, Oscar award-winning documentary down to, like, films made by people in the community, and it's always donation. And as a photographer, really wanting to know how to like do verite, I thought the Maysles Institute would be a perfect place to go, because Albert Maysles was a still photographer. I just thought it would be the best place for me. It was in Harlem. It was close to where I lived. And so I started out as a student. And my teacher at the time was Virgilio Bravo, who's now the director of education at the Tribeca Film Institute. And so he was teaching an adult collaborative class. And it was basically like a 10-week class that taught you how to translate your idea from a documentary into, like, a proposal, a budget, an active, tangible, you can go out and seek funding for your idea after these 10 weeks. And so I took that class, and, I became a part of the Maysles community. And then from there, I went to work at Tribeca because of V. Like, he got to know me as a student at the Maysles Institute, and he felt comfortable enough extending me employment. And so then when I got to the Tribeca Film Institute, I was really privy to the inner workings of, like, funding and what you needed to tell a viable commercial story on screen. And so then once, I was working there, David and I both, we were both working as teaching artists. And for Tribeca, so we would go into the public school system and show films that had been at the Tribeca Film Institute, and these films sort of had curriculum alongside them. So we would go in classrooms and use the films and teach the young people how to make movies, and then move the screen at Tribeca. And so, to make a long story short, David and I both worked there. And so, yeah, it was just very, very helpful. So after I was working at Tribeca up until we really started full-time production on terror. And then once sort of we had gotten the funding and I had learned how it worked, I went back to Maysles and taught the class. Like, once we had moved on to Tribeca, I then went back. And so I taught it for 2 sessions at the Maysles Institute, the documentary filmmaking collaborative for adults.
That's awesome. So it's like full circle. I like that.
Yes.
That is awesome. We did just get one more question. What should Muslims learn from your documentary?
It's a good question. I think there are very practical things that Muslims can learn from the documentary, as far as like how surveillance is actually executed. I think a lot of people know and understand that surveillance is prevalent in the United States, but a lot of people don't really understand that informants are paid to go to mosques and collect license plates. I think the film will really reveal for Muslim communities the types of conversations that these informants engage in. Like, you hear on the news that someone was arrested for wanting to plant a pipe bomb, but how does that conversation start? What are the things to look out for when a stranger asks you certain things? So I think, even like digital surveillance, there's a big element of terror that has to deal with Facebook. Just thinking about the information that the government can garner from your social media or your presence online. So I think all of these things and also just, I would say the Islamophobia that's prevalent within the FBI's concept of surveillance. Sort of how Islam has been criminalized. You will see this in effect in terror. Like, I think the Muslim community will see its fears validated on screen when they watch this. Things they may have supposed will actually be on screen. So I think it will really provide an education for all communities, but Muslims in particular.
I just thought of something. How did you feel the media covered the Paris attacks? How did you respond to that and their coverage of that and the way it all sort of went down?
Well, I think after Paris, after any terrorist attack, there's always sort of a wave of Islamophobia that's unleashed. There's always added surveillance in Muslim communities. After Friday prayer, you'll see additional police outside the mosque. But I think Paris really indicates the problem with trying to catch terrorists, right? Because in Paris, they knew one individual had been in the documentary proclaiming jihad 2 years before he engaged in this attack. And it's very similar to like the case in Boston with the Tsarnaev brothers, whom the FBI knew about prior to them engaging in the act of terrorism at the Boston Marathon. So, it is very hard to predict who will do what. Right? And so I think the lesson here, because in both cases the government knew, both the French government and the United States government knew about these individuals. But I think it's kind of interesting that they didn't have enough evidence to keep those individuals behind bars prior to them committing. So I think, I don't know what we do there. Why did this them? But I think the real lesson there is that we cannot predict acts of terror, and it is very dangerous to go into communities operating under that premise that one can quote unquote find preemptively a terrorist, because my opinion is that the FBI, in trying to find terrorists, is often creating them, sort of sort of coming into these communities and posing these scenarios and posing dangerous ideas where there are none. That's my suggestion. Yes, we must root out terrorism, but not at the expense of particular communities and not at the expense of looking at the fact that acts of terror can exist in all communities, not just in Muslim communities.
Awesome. Well, it's 3:40, so I think we'll wrap up. Thank you so much, Blair.
Thank you.
Awesome.
If anybody does have questions, can they tweet them at you,
Sure.
Simple ones,
sure.
Yeah.
It's camera, CAMERA_meander, MEANDER at Twitter.
And we'll maybe be able to see Terror in the next few months, or when it's broadcast, or.
That we shall. We have a couple festival commitments which I can't mention yet, but it will be out and about.
Awesome.
And we have a Facebook page for Terror. It's Terror Documentary. Terror is also on Twitter at TerrorDoc. So yeah, if anyone wants to have any more information about how you can see the film, just check the Facebook page or the Twitter.
And do you guys have a trailer? You don't, do you?
We do not have a trailer. We're sort of still we're riding the secrecy wave until broadcast. But if you follow us on Facebook and Twitter, you can definitely stay abreast of where we'll be.
I like that. I like the secrecy. That's cool. Well, thank you so much, Blair.
Oh, thank you. She does podcast is amazing. I will totally plug you guys. Thank you so much for providing space for women journalists and giving us a voice and more visibility. It's very, very important.
Thank you. You're a big part of that. Yeah.
And next week we'll have Anna Sale. She's the host and managing editor of WNYC's podcast, Death, Sex, and Money. And then we'll have a chat with her. That one will be the following Wednesday, but at 6 p.m., not 3 p.m. And
cool.
And then also Sarah wants to remind people to review and rate us on iTunes because it's very helpful. Right,
And
Sarah?
easy. It's easy, but does a lot for us. And yeah, we appreciate it. And thanks for joining us today.
Yes. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.